Hi. In this module, I'm going to talk about the issue of the validity of measures. That is, the issue of whether or not the things that we go out and measure for our study really capture the concepts that we are interested in our theory. Translating concepts into indicators that we can measure out in the real world actually turns out to be quite difficult. When we go out and identify a measure that we want to go out and collect in our study, the two key issues that come up are what we refer to as the validity of the measure and its reliability. A measure is said to have high validity. In this case, we're talking about the most broad definition of validity, construct validity, if it is somehow capturing or strongly related to the perhaps abstract concept of interest that is the subject of our study. So, for example, if we're conducting a study to look at the relationship between egalitarianism and economic growth, we would be concerned about whether what we are going out and measuring in countries or regions and claiming to be a measure of egalitarianism really captures important aspects of that abstract concept. We say that a measure has low construct validity if it turns out to be unrelated to whatever our interest is in the study. When we talk about the validity of measures, there are specific types of validity that we are especially concerned with. One is content validity. Does our measure capture all of the meaningful dimensions of interest for the concept that is part of our theory, or just selected dimensions? I'll give a more concrete example in just a little bit. Another aspect of validity is what we refer to as face validity. Is our measure something that we could explain to a layperson? And does it have some sort of common sense appeal where it is obvious that it indeed should represent the concept in which we're interested in? Finally, criterion validity. Is the measure that we are offering correlated with other measures that have already been validated in other studies? So, for example, if in studying a particular concept, there have already been a number of studies that make use of different measures that are widely accepted as measuring that concept. Are there studies, or can we prove that the measure we propose is correlated or related to those other measures? Let's talk about a concrete example. Blood pressure as a measure of health. You've probably had your blood pressure measured. In fact, I hope you've had your blood pressure measured. And in studies of health, it's very common to collect information on blood pressure as a measure of health. So we can talk about how it fits with these different types of validity. Now there's content validity. Certainly, blood pressure is excellent with respect to content validity when it comes to cardiovascular health. Whether its content validity for health overall is adequate is another question. Health has many dimensions: emotional health, mental health, there are other organ systems, the liver, and so forth, where blood pressure may not really capture all of the dimensions of health in those other domains. Face validity. Well, most of us have had our blood pressure taken. Our doctors have told us that it's very important, so it seems commonsensical that blood pressure should be a measure of cardiovascular health. And finally, criterion validity. Have studies established that blood pressure is indeed related to other measures of cardiovascular health, or to the rate of dying or the rate of developing heart disease? Well, it turns out there have been studies going back over decades that have made the relationship of blood pressure to cardiovascular health very clear. Now, another aspect of validity is what we refer to as internal and external validity. These typically refer to situations when we're talking about experiments, but they have more broader application. Internal validity refers to the measure and the design of the study and the aspects that are helpful in figuring out whether indeed we have evidence of cause and effect. We say something has high internal validity if we're confident that the measures and our way of analyzing them really will give us insight into cause and effect. External validity refers to the ability of our measures to generalize to a larger population and the ability of our study to generate results to a larger population. In fact, it turns out there are trade-offs where sometimes in the quest for internal validity to prove cause and effect, we may make use of data that's so unusual or so specialized in terms of the population it covers that we become worried about external validity. Another thing that we're interested in when it comes to measurement is reliability. Reliability refers to the consistency of the results of a measure across repeated applications. Does the same measure yield the same result every time you carry it out? Or are the results highly dispersed? This is an important issue. The implications are several. One is that if individual measurements are prone to substantial random error, that can affect the analysis. If there's a lot of error, then that may obscure relationships between the groups being compared or relationships between variables of interest. Measurement error in particular may make relationships between variables appear weaker than they actually are. It's a bit technical, and we won't be able to get into the details of why that's the case just here. So how do we reduce measurement error? Researchers go to a lot of trouble to minimize measurement error and increase reliability. When people are designing questionnaires, they pay careful attention to the design of the questions to maximize their clarity. And then for outcomes of interest that vary naturally, researchers make multiple measurements, and then they use perhaps their average in an analysis. And then they might also specify a protocol for the collection of the measure to try to, again, isolate or screen out other sources of variation that create error. Let's think about some examples to help make this a little more concrete. One is blood pressure, which I've been talking about. It turns out that blood pressure varies a lot for the same person across the course of the day. You've probably noticed this when you've been in the doctor's office or in other occasions when you've measured your blood pressure. The readings can vary greatly over the space of a few minutes. So a single measurement of blood pressure is not typically considered reliable, again because measurements vary a great deal. Doctors often won't diagnose high blood pressure until they've made multiple measurements. So when people are collecting blood pressure in a survey as part of a study of health, they may make repeated measurements of blood pressure and then take the average as the one to be used in the analysis. And they may also specify very specific criteria for when to collect blood pressure and under what circumstances to account for known variation across the day in levels of blood pressure. Another issue is income. We've talked about it previously, so I won't talk about it in detail here, but income turns out to be very hard to measure, except in very special cases where people have fixed incomes and salaries. If you talk to somebody engaged in agriculture or a day laborer, their reported income may vary a lot from day to day, depending on how business was. So people have to think carefully about how to measure income, whether it's over the year, the month, or even the last week, whether it should be averaged across multiple observations. Finally, here's the example of time allocation. It turns out that when we conduct studies where we ask people how they've been using their time, how often they've been engaging in certain types of activities, the responses can vary a lot from week to week, day to day. So people have to think about how to average responses across multiple surveys to get a more reliable measure. So validity and reliability are two issues that we're especially interested in when it comes to measurement. And these are things that social science researchers pay a great deal of attention to in the design of their studies. Because if you don't get the validity and the reliability right, the results of your study may not yield useful conclusions about the theory of interest.